So, ladies and gentlemen, no further ado, help me welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Benjamin Barber.
Good morning. It's early, I know for you. It's actually about noon in New York, so I'm feeling good. I'm waking up. I hope you all have enough coffee to do the same. It's a great pleasure to be here with you in the Valley, Peninsula, San Francisco region, California. They all kind of merge into one when you come from the East Coast. But I know that this particular region has a very special role to play, both here in California, in the nation, and in the world. And therefore, it's a particular pleasure to talk to you about some of the common problems we face. And I'm going to focus on two things this morning. The advertised theme, which is the theme of the role of cities in a world of dysfunctional nations. We're the most efficient, the most pragmatic, the most problem-solving governmental entities in the world, not just in the United States, but around the world, are increasingly cities, where cities are doing what nation states and international institutions can't or won't do. And that's extremely important, and it has changed the nature of the challenges we face. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happened and why that's the case. But then, because we are here in Silicon Valley, we just heard a summary of some of the remarkable outcomes on this year's index, suggesting how extraordinary the private tech sector is and how well it's done. I also want to talk to you about something that disturbs me as a citizen and as somebody who was a physics major in college and who cares deeply about science and technology, and that is the way in which I think sometimes the tech domain sees itself as part of the private sector and not part of the public and civic sector. And as the world needs our cities and the leadership of mayors, our cities and governance needs the civic and public leadership of its tech companies, which I think have fallen far short of their possibilities. If you go back to a book I wrote in 1984 called Strong Democracy, which has become a kind of classic of participatory democracy, I wrote back then that there is a new emerging digital interactive technology. That was back in the days of Warner Amex Cube system. It was just the beginning of interactivity. But I said because democracy is about communication and bringing people together, this new emerging tech sector could be extraordinarily promising for the prospects of democracy. I was back then a kind of cyber zealot, someone who really thought the new tech would make a big difference for democracy. Well, technology has flourished and democracy has declined. Technology and the private sector have made a lot of money and done very well and contributed in many different ways to our private and personal lives, with social media, with knowledge, with the cloud, but has done almost nothing for the world of public goods, common goods. For me, one of the most disastrous things that happened in the Clinton administration, and I was advisor to President Clinton for many years, was the 1996 new Federal Communications Act, which argued because of spectrum abundance, we could privatize the new media, just emerging then, not treat them as a public utility the way we had in the 1934 Federal Communications Act treated broadcast media, radio, and then television as public utilities. The internet, digital technology, is a public utility of deep value to the public. And the notion that spectrum abundance, there's so many ways in and out, means you don't have to treat it as a public utility, has meant that its extraordinary civic promise, its extraordinary capacity to create a smaller world in which we can communicate virtually in ways that enhance our capacity to understand one another and govern together, that simply hasn't been used. Mr. Zuckerberg said a while ago on Charlie Rose, I want to be the place on Facebook where when people do things together, that's where they come. As far as I can make out, the one place where it really counts when we do things together, governance, doesn't exist there. We don't have a civic, a democratic Facebook. We have Google Hangouts. I actually wrote and helped develop the little video, the 90-second video. Go check it out on the relationship between Google Hangouts and the past of coffee houses and the Agora and common space. But in fact, I want a civic Google Hangout. I want a hangout where citizens can hang out with one another. I want a world of technology in which we don't just say what we like, but we make clear what we don't like. I want a Facebook where it's not about living with and being just with friends, but being with adversaries. Democracy is a world where we have to live with people we don't like and don't agree with, not people just like us, who track the same way and have the same interests and come from the same backgrounds. Technology has an enormous capacity to help us do that, but it doesn't do that. I want an information system that doesn't just tell you what you want to know, but sometimes tells you what you don't want to know. Maybe it's the other side. It's great that Amazon tells me, from what you've been buying, here are the next books you should read. And then it says books just like the ones I've been reading. How about saying to me, here are the books you've been reading, you've been missing out. There are a lot of other books quite different than the ones you're reading. Those are the ones you should be reading. And here's some suggestions. And I say that not just, to make light. I really think it's serious that in a world of diversity and multiculturalism and inequality, where so many of our problems come from trying to deal with people very different than us, we don't use this extraordinarily potent technology to help us deal with difference, with adversity, with opposition, with disagreement, but instead just use it for useful social media purposes of friendship and getting together and buying things and continuing to express the same tastes you did before. We were all horrified by what happened a couple weeks ago in Paris, but let me tell you something. The French understanding of what they call ridicule, ridiculous, making people ridiculous, is a very French cultural phenomenon. And it hides behind free speech. But for many people in many parts of the world, including Christians here and Jews in Israel and Muslims all over the world, to make religion ridiculous simply for the fun of it, which is seen as a great French tradition, crosses cultures in ways that are very difficult for many people to abide. We need to understand that more. Muslims need to understand that the French have a long tradition of ridiculing everything, including them. But the French need to understand that ridiculing people's deepest religious convictions can have consequences. No rationalization, no excuse for violence, but the fact is, people who care deeply about their beliefs, to see them ridiculed just for the hell of it is not necessarily the best thing. How do we use these technologies? How do we use social media? How do we use the enormous virtual potential of communicating across the world to help people understand one another, how different they are, and how perhaps something that seems horrendously offensive in one culture is seen as, in the other, as a kind of useful playfulness? Those are things that we can do with technology, but it hasn't happened. And I'm going to talk now about cities, but I just want to say that this new technology, digital technology, the cloud, social media, should have, in addition to the vital entertainment and commercial purposes, in addition to providing about a third of the hits on the web for pornography, and that's great that the newest technology is used for the oldest purposes. That's always been the way these things work. Wouldn't it be great if, in addition to pornography and buying things and shopping and making friends, this technology also played a vital role in overcoming inequality, bridging difference, increasing understanding between people in different cultures who are now living together? In the index, it was pointed out that this is an extraordinarily diverse country, state, and region. LA has 161 foreign languages spoken in its schools, and it was pointed out that the peninsula here, this region actually has more diversity than almost anywhere else. But what are we doing to use the technology not to obliterate diversity, but both to enhance it and make possible better communication across diversity? Net neutrality, I'm a fan, but let me tell you something. Net neutrality as applied to individuals and groups is great. Nobody should have a privileged quick access through money on the net. But the net should not be neutral. Its public good functions trump, I believe, its private functions in the way that public sovereignty trumps the private. The net shouldn't be neutral as between private and public purposes. It should privilege its public purposes, its civic goals, and be put to those uses. Right now, there's no danger that the public's going to trump the private because the public hardly exists on the net, but we need more. So I start with a kind of plea to those of you who live in an area of great cities and small cities and communities in the neighborhood, the shadow of one of the great cities of the world, San Francisco, that please think with me about not just what you can do to make money make innovation off of technology. The VC folks think not just what you can invest in to make some quick dough for the guys who you represent, but think how you can use venture capital to do things that are risky in the public domain. I love the riskiness, the risk-taking of the VC guys, but the places where we have to take the biggest risks is in confronting inequality, confronting difference, confronting the religious clash around the world now that has set Muslims against others, secularists against the religious. There is a role there that you need to play. And when you do, that extraordinary promise of new technology, of digital technology, electronic communication, the web, virtual platforms, will have its finest realization. And that is necessary because we do live in a world, and this is a great place to do this experiment, we live in a world where it is no longer nation states that dominate public goods, the pursuit of public interests. On the contrary, you know, for 400 years, the primary institution, we all learned it in college and high school, the primary political institution has been the nation state. A people, the French, the Germans, the Japanese, the Italians, a territory staked out with borders and boundaries, and a constitutional government that gives sovereign power to that territory and to that people. That's the nation state. 1500, 1600 it was born, and inside the nation state grew up this powerful understanding of self-government, of democracy. Without the nation state, we wouldn't have democracy today. So the nation state has been a powerful institution for 400 years and remains in the textbooks the primary governing institutions. You study political science, what do you study? You study the nation state, you study America, you study comparative government, comparative national governments, international relations, the relationship between nations. The nation state remains on paper the crucial one. But by the end of World War II, the Europeans already saw the limitations of the nation state. Jean Monnet said a system based on sovereignty and warring states, territorially divided, would continue to destroy Europe as the two great wars of the last century did, and called for a pooled sovereignty, a new union of European countries in which the borders between France and Germany and Italy and Spain were obliterated, and in which a common regional sovereignty, European-wide sovereignty would be forged. And we've seen for 60 or 70 years an amazing experiment, a little trouble now, but an experiment in pooled sovereignty. So already 75 years ago, we knew that sovereignty and the nation state had problems. If it wasn't clear then, it is clear to every nation in the world now that the territorial sovereign nation state is utterly incapable of dealing with the transborder, global, interdependent problems of the modern world. Example, when I was growing up in Manhattan in the 1940s, my mom used to say, "Don't go to Brooklyn today, dear. You know, there's a virus over there." The Brooklyn virus. I don't think we worry today about the Brooklyn virus. We worry about West Nile virus, Ebola, HIV, Mexican pig flu, these global pandemics. Health is a global problem, not a national or local problem. My first car in the 50s was a Chevy, great American car. I was a patriot. I wanted an American car. Today, I drive, because I'm a patriot, a BMW. You know why? It's built in South Carolina with 70% American parts. The Chevrolet's built in Mexico, most of them, with 65% foreign parts. What's an American car? Doesn't exist anymore. Manufacturing is a global phenomenon. Coca-Cola and McDonald's, the two great American brands, do over 70% of their business outside the United States. Nice weather this week, but it gets kind of hot in the summer, but I don't think anyone talks about San Jose warming or California warming or US warming. We talk about global warming, global climate change. Ecology and climate are global problems. Now, here's the question. If finance and immigration and jobs and terrorism and ecology and health and technology are all interdependent and global, why do we think we can confront the challenges and issues they present to us with 17th century independent bordered sovereign states? And the answer is we can't. Even the most powerful nation state in the world, the United States, simply can't do it. We've seen the asymmetry of modern war. A B-1 bomber is no match for a suicide bomber. And all the money in the world and the great Navy and Air Force and so on don't prevent people from doing what happened at Charlie Hebdo in Paris or in New York on 9/11 or in Madrid in the subways or London or elsewhere around the world where a small handful of interdependent terrorists can in effect defeat independent, powerful nation states and their militaries because of the asymmetry of the modern world in which we live. So we need political institutions capable of dealing effectively with both local and global problems, and I have a candidate. Let's stop talking about prime ministers and presidents, and let's start talking about mayors and city councilors. Let's stop talking about nation states, and let's start talking about cities and regions and counties. Let's stop talking about those passive television-watching citizens who constitute the national citizenry and are cynical, dispirited, often don't vote, and start talking about the engaged citizens of civil society and of local government who all over the world in their own towns and cities remain committed and involved. You've seen the terrible numbers when you ask people, do you trust your government in the United States? And it's true all over the world. You ask, do you trust the President of the United States? Under 50%. Whether it's Bush or Obama, say they trust him. The Supreme Court, which used to be kind of independent and well-liked and respected, now it's down to about 40%. The most democratic institution in our country, the Congress, for which we all vote every 2 years, has an 8% trust rating. Less than 1 in 10 Americans who actually vote every year for the congressman trust the institution to which their congresspeople belong. Now, that's devastating for democracy. Democracy is a system built on trust. If citizens don't trust the government they elect, it means they don't trust themselves. And when citizens don't trust themselves, they either drop out or they become cynical or they become angry. But it's bad for democracy. But now, when you ask that same question, do you trust your government, and apply it to the mayor and the city council, not just here in the United States, but around the world, the numbers go up to 65, 70, 75, and even 80%. And it's not based on whether your party's in government. It's just, well, yeah, the mayor, she's local. She's my neighbor. She was on the city council. She used to be on the zoning board. She was in the PTA. She's one of us. Ed Koch used to go around mayor of New York a while ago saying, "How am I doing?" Remember that? He was his favorite, "How am I doing?" Imagine President Bush or President Obama going around saying, "How am I doing?" to local neighbors. Wouldn't want to hear the answer, but in fact, there'd be nowhere to go. Where, on Pennsylvania Avenue? Ask people, "How am I doing?" Mayors are neighbors. Mayors are problem solvers. City councilors grapple with the same problems we grapple with, and that means we trust them even when we don't always agree with them. That means they get the benefit of the doubt. Cities is where, in a democracy, the rubber hits the road. You have to deal with real issues. Twice in the last couple of years, the government of the United States of America, the greatest country in the world, closed its doors for over a week. First thing is, nobody noticed. The second thing is, maybe you could get away with that up in Washington, D.C., but imagine closing San Jose or San Francisco. Imagine if the mayor introduced me and said, "By the way, I can't agree with some folks on the city council, so we're closing San Jose for a week or two." No metro, no schools, no cops, no firemen, no sanitation, no hospitals, all closed. You can't close a city. You never could, not in the Middle Ages under war and plague and siege, and not today, because cities is where the real things of government take place, the things we all care about, the things we all notice. And mayors know it, which means mayors are problem solvers, not ideologues. They're pragmatists, not rigid people who stand on principle. Back in the 1980s, Teddy Kollek, who was then the mayor of Jerusalem, had to him happen what still happens in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv today. Imams, rabbis, Christian prelates came into his office, he was the mayor of Jerusalem, and said, "Mr. Mayor, we deserve special access to the holy sites." And then the arguments would start between Muslims and Jews and Christians about the historical precedents that meant one or the other should have privileged access to the holy sites. And Teddy Kollek said after, I said, gentlemen, please spare me your sermons, and I will fix your sewers." That's what mayors do. They fix sewers. Mayor de Blasio came in with a great program. I love his program for New York, more affordable housing. You need some of that out here. More preschool education and so on. But just as he was getting started, we were hit last winter with 6 quick snowstorms in a row. It's not that he got diverted or detracked, but he had to spend 2 months getting the snow off the roads. Now you might say that's too bad because he couldn't get to his healthy progressive agenda. I say no, wrong, because he understood that the mayor of a city has to serve people every day in the most mundane ways, and those mundane things, getting the snow off the roads, is essential if kids are going to get to their preschool programs, if we're going to be able to afford to build affordable housing. So pragmatism is the signature of what mayors do. Problem solving is how they get things done. And that makes our cities far more efficient, far more participatory, and in the long term, far more democratic than any other level of government. And mark my words, people say all the time, well, which level of government is more efficient? The United States, California, the county, San Mateo County, or Santa Clara or San Jose? Which level of governance? And I'm here to tell you the city is not a level of governance. Those are abstract political science administrative terms. The city is the quintessential human community. And ask anyone in this room, where were you born, where do you work, where'd you get married? They might say the USA or California, but they're much more likely to say Sacramento or Buffalo or Louisville. Because cities are where we're born, where our parents come from, where we grow up and are educated, where we get married, where we work, where we pray and we play, and we get old and we die. They are us. They are an extension of the human family. They are how we first organized in the very beginnings of civilizations. People came together. Density and proximity is something human beings loved, and that forged the city. So the city isn't just an administrative level of governance for political scientists to think about, and where should we give the authority, who should have the tax powers. Cities are our communities. And that means we care deeply about how they work and how effective they are and whether they get the job done. And we want politicians who are our neighbors. And that's what they are. Cory Booker, twice when he was the mayor of Newark, stopped on the way to work. Once he broke up a fight that was turned out to have been a mugging. He didn't even know that. And another time he went into a burning building, smoking, lots of people overcome by smoke, and took out 2 or 3 of the people who were overcome by smoke himself. Now, it's not that Bush or Obama wouldn't do that, given the choice. It wasn't a matter of courage. It's a matter of, in a city, mayors are there. They're neighbors. The president would have to overcome his Secret Service detail and say, excuse me, I'm going to that burning building. Imagine that happening. I have talked around the world to a lot of global national political leaders. I have never talked to one without going through security, being searched, special passports presented in advance, metal detectors, and so on. But when the mayor of San Jose came in this morning, he said, hey, Dr. Barber, here I am. I said, where's your security detail? I didn't have to go through any security to meet you. Because our mayors are us. Yes, they govern on our behalf, but there's not that sense of there's some regal, monarchical personality who needs special protection, who people are going to shoot. I said to Cory Booker when he started running for the Senate, I said, you're not going up the ladder, you're going down the ladder when you leave Newark and become senator. Because you're going from a functioning political entity to a non-functioning political entity. And Boris Johnson, the interesting and rather bizarre but effective mayor of London, as you know, has decided he wants to run for parliament so that he becomes prime minister. And I said to him, and I published a piece in the Evening Standard over there, saying that if you leave London and become prime minister, you will have a great fall. You're going down, not up. And you will find the things you could do in London you won't be able to do in 10 Downing Street. Because the fact is, our cities work and work well. So I need, and you need to know that when we look for effective, pragmatic, hands-on government that actually deals with the realities that we have to deal with, it's our cities we need to be looking at. But, I also said to start with, we live in a global world, an interdependent world where independent territorial states can't solve problems. And if you were following closely, you'd say, whoa, Dr. Barber. First you said we needed global political institutions. And then you said, let's go back to cities, which are local institutions. Aren't you going the wrong direction? You're supposed to be climbing up. Give us a global governance. Instead, you're going down. I am, but let me tell you why. Because devolution, decentralization to cities, takes us to where all of the planetary global human problems we face are. There's not one problem that cities face, not undocumented workers and illegal immigration, not maldistribution of resources and deep inequality, not guns and violence, not the possibility of the police not just protecting the citizenry, but brutalizing the citizenry, transportation, deep water ports, trade, culture. There's not one of these issues that cities face as a public challenge that is not a global public challenge. Here's the equation. When cities face their problems locally, the problems they face turn out to be the same problems that cities all over the world face, and thus are global problems. And it's not an accident that cities are beginning to address effectively together problems that nation states together can't address. Take illegal, undocumented workers moving around the world. We know that we live in a world of 18th century national political laws and 21st century economic logic. Why are there so many undocumented workers? Not just from Mexico to the US, from Guatemala to Mexico, not just from the sub-Sahara to Morocco, but from Morocco to Spain and Spain all over Europe. Why? Because the logic of economics today is global. The jobs are global and people simply go where they are. And of course what happens is they suddenly come across these boundaries, these borders. But those are political and legal borders that have nothing to do with the logic of the interdependent global economy. So we have a problem. And where do they end up? Not in the farms, not in the villages. they end up in San Jose and New York and Paris and London and Manchester. They end up in our big cities where the jobs are. And now mayors have a choice. They can say, excuse me, you're illegal, and my national government doesn't like you here, although my national government seems to turn its back and doesn't do anything about it, except make a lot of noise. So I have two choices: chase you out or ignore you on the one hand, or try to make sure that if you are here, you have the right papers, you have the right spirit, you have the right attitude towards schools and health and crime, that if you drive, you have a license, that if you have a job, we know about it, that if you commit a crime, the police know where you are. We can do that, or we can pretend like the national government you don't exist. Well, they argue about an immigration law for decades at a time. Well, mayors all over, not just here, not just in New York, where de Blasio has a new urban ID program, but in Hamburg, where Mayor Olaf Scholz is giving urban visas to so-called illegal immigrants without a Schengen visa, without that European visa. You need to be there because he says they're here. I have a prediction. The road to citizenship in the United States over the next 10 or 20 years is going to come through what cities and states do to give legitimacy to those who are there if they obey the law, if they live as good citizens. That will be the way we do it, not through some national immigration law, which will not happen in the ideologically gridlocked Congress of the United States. And that's a good thing, which is to say cities will solve for America a problem that the state no longer can. Same thing in Europe. Climate is very much in the same thing. We have watched now for 20 years, since in the early 1990s, the Keynote process, the so-called Committee of the Parties UN process started. It led to Copenhagen 5 years ago. Next year in Paris, next fall, winter in Paris, will be the final meeting of 22 years of unsuccessful nation-state negotiation about climate change. During the 22 years in which the UN has been trying very hard to get the world's nations to do something about climate change, we know the world has gotten hotter and hotter. 9 of the last 10 years are the hottest in the history of the world since it was measured. This last year was the very hottest. It goes on. Half the politicians in the Congress say, oh, that's just propaganda. There is no such thing as climate change. And if there is, it's just natural. Human beings have nothing to do with it. And elsewhere, for political reasons or the power of the petrochemical industry, no progress is made. As a result, 5 or 6 years ago, Mayor Ken Livingstone of London and then with Mayor Bloomberg of New York started a C40 climate cities, where cities said, what can we do together? How can we solve this problem? And cities have now been working in the C40 and a number of other organizations to take measures on their own, not waiting for states, but saying we have to do this. By the way, 80% of GDP comes from cities, and 80% of carbon emissions come from cities, which means cities have both the wherewithal and the need to deal with it. So, and I'm going to close with this, it is time now when we stop complaining and whimpering about our ineffective, dysfunctional nation states here and abroad, and start saying, let's take the institutions that work in our cities and let's bring them together so that they can do together collectively what they are already doing one by one. And in the last chapter of If Mayors Ruled the World, the book which launched this set of ideas, I propose a global parliament of mayors, and to my surprise, there are now 120 mayors in cities around the world that have said, let's do it. And next October, in London and Bristol, will be the first sitting of a global parliament of mayors, where cities from all over the world, all 5 continents, from Bogota and Mexico City to LA and Singapore and Seoul and Barcelona and Rome, will come together and ask the question, what can we together as cities do to solve the problems that we have to solve if we are to have a sustainable planet? Because local, regional, and even state solutions simply don't work in an interdependent global world. Interdependent problems demand interdependent solutions, and that calls for interdependent institutions that work. We've got a UN that's really the disunited nations. We've got the IMF and some economic organizations that reflect the interests of the powerful and the wealthy, but not necessarily the interests of the people of the planet. But our cities truly represent the cross-section of people. They face the problems of inequality and ghettos and violence directly. They have to find ways for people to live together because in the city, people live in close quarters with one another, as we saw in Paris. So the cities are where we need to do it. We need to go back to where we started with civilization, to our cities, whether it was Athens or Damascus or Cairo, cities much older than the nation states to which they belong, and ask them to pick up the burden not just of governing themselves as they're already doing, but together helping to govern a world in desperate need of collective action and cooperation by those capable of doing it. So let me finish with two invitations. Let me first invite all of you to look up Global Parliament of Mayors.org and see what we're doing and see how you might make a contribution to that. But this particular area, which already has so many robust and vital cities and has one of the most extraordinary private economic sectors, dominated, though not just exclusively, by technology, new tech, and innovation, let me ask you to figure out how you can contribute both to the urban economy, to urban sustainability, to public goods here in the valley, and how you can then take that and make it global by making the great cities of this valley part of a new global governance structure in which we take the ideals of the ancient polis and extend them to a new global cosmopolis in which democracy and sustainability can once again flourish. Thank you very much.